So first of all, welcome. Happy January and New Year to everyone. My name's Claire Johnson. I work at Brighton and Sussex Medical School as part of the admissions team. Hopefully some of you may have been along to some of these talks last year or previously, so you kind of know the gist. We've moved it all back online again for this evening due to kind of the raising COVID levels and due to some of the restrictions at the University of Sussex as well. So we're back online. Few bits of housekeeping. This session is being recorded. We will hopefully be able to edit it and get it out to you via email in about a week's time, so you'll be able to rewatch it if you would like. We'll be on our YouTube channel, and that's where you can also find a lot of our other talks that we've had in the past, so you can go back and watch previous talks if you haven't seen them already. So let me just share my screen so we can kind of have a quick look to see where everyone is coming from. So there's quite a few local people, so from Eastbourne, Littlehampton, Hoe, obviously Brighton. So great to see some people from internationally, from Canada and Dubai there as well. So brilliant, nice to have you along. Hopefully it's not too cold in Canada. We've been very mild over here, and I'm sure in Dubai you are sunning yourselves as well. So just a few there. So next question I am going to ask is, if it works, what age range are you currently in? This is just really for our interest to see who's kind of attending and what kind of age groups we are. So obviously we kind of aim this at students that are considering going on to university, but we are aware that we also get graduates and parents and teachers and careers advisors attending these talks as well. So it's really interesting for us to be able to see that as well. So brilliant. Thank you very much for participating in our Menti. So as most people should have joined by now, we will get started with the talk. If I stop my share. So this evening's talk is being delivered by Richard de Visser. So Richard has worked in the fields of health psychology and public health for over 25 years. He is a reader in psychology at Brighton and Sussex Medical School and in the School of Psychology at the University of Sussex, where he has received awards for his individual and group teaching. He is also co-author of the textbook Psychology for Medicine and Healthcare, which is now in its 3rd edition. Richard completed a BSc in psychology at the University of Melbourne and a PhD at the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society. He then undertook postdoctoral work at Birkbeck College, University of London, before moving to Sussex. Richard's research interests span a broad range of topics in health psychology, including sexuality and relationships, gender and health, alcohol use of health services and cross-cultural analysis, has expertise in quantitative and qualitative methods, interventional studies and mixed methods designs. Richard is also the principal design lead for years 1 and 2 at Brighton and Sussex Medical School and teaches on a variety of different modules at the medical school as well. So sorry for that delayed kind of introduction, but I will hand you over to Richard now, who will deliver the presentation. Oh, just one thing. If you have any questions during the talk, if you can put them into the Q&A section, and then we will be answering questions at the end. But I hope you enjoy the talk this evening.
Okay. Thanks very much, Claire. I'm going to share my screen so I can get the right images up there. And yeah, better introduction than I could have done kind of at this stage of the year or the day or whatever it might be. So thanks very much everyone for coming along. I'm going to be talking about dry January, and it was interesting to see your responses when you were asked about ages. Now, no, not everyone responded, but there were quite a few people who weren't yet at the kind of legal drinking age, at least in the UK. So this may be something that's well, it's great to see that you've still come along, that you're interested in finding out about dry January and alcohol use, even if you're not yet a new or established drinker. And hopefully some of the older people watching will be able to reflect on this from their own experiences. So I'm going to be talking about dry January and whether it makes a difference, for people's health and their well-being and their kind of sense of self and control over their drinking. So I will talk briefly about what dry January is in case you don't know. I will talk about the research that we've done over the last 8 or so years. with dry January and give an idea about what can we say about does dry January actually make a difference? Is it worth trying out or not? My email address is there. I've also put into the chat some links for some of the key papers that I'll refer to as well. So you can feel free to either find the papers yourselves or come and track me down through email if you'd want to. But dry January is basically, as it says in the image here, it's about having a holiday from booze. It's about taking a break from drinking. It's not a campaign which is all about stopping people from drinking altogether. The Alcohol Concern, which is the charity behind dry January, recognizes that we do live in a culture where most people do drink, but a lot of people do drink excessively. And the idea is to get people to pause, stop, have a think about their drinking and maybe reset things and hopefully follow on with slightly healthier patterns of drinking. Now my screen doesn't want to go page down. That's annoying. That's frustrating if I get stuck on the screen. What I'm going to do, I'm going to stop my sharing and I'm going to go back in and see if I can fix that problem, because I don't want to be stuck on the first slide for the whole talk, and you probably won't want me to be as well. Okay, now I can go. Good, it worked. Okay, so this is taken straight from the Alcohol Change Dry January website, and as it states there, Dry January is the UK's 1 month alcohol-free challenge. So the idea is to get people to stop drinking for the month of January. It isn't about giving anything up, it's about getting something back. Get your fun back, get your energy back, get your calm back, get your you back. And so I'm going to talk about whether you actually do get those things back, whether there's any kind of evidence for that. And the idea is that dry January means going alcohol-free for the whole month. Not just that, by doing it by yourself, but by doing it through Dry January, the official Dry January campaign. The idea is to use Alcohol Change UK's tools and resources to get these benefits. And we'll talk about, as well as talking about the effects of taking part in Dry January, I'm going to talk about the importance of using that support and how beneficial it can be. And then we'll talk about, what you'll notice, what are some of the differences. So Dry January is run by Alcohol Change UK, which is an alcohol charity that whose mission is to basically get to try to reduce the alcohol-related harm in society. And Dry January has been running in the UK since 2013. I first paired up with them in 2014 to do some research on Dry January. It was mutually beneficial because they wanted to find out what was going on and I wanted to find out what was going on as well. And Dry January since then has kind of spread, and there's a lot of similar things. 2 years ago, Dry January in the UK partnered with a range of charities in France to launch Dry January in France, and that's been going on. And it was really interesting and quite rewarding to be involved in some of the negotiations and discussions around setting it up there based on the success of Dry January in the UK. But Dry January is but one of many alcohol abstinence challenges. There are others in the UK like Triathlon or Go Sober for October. There's the 1 year no beer campaign as well that runs. So obviously it's not just about beer, but it's thinking of, okay, if you're a beer drinker, we'll see what we can do there. It also runs in other countries. These things tend to be in the cooler months, maybe when people aren't out having picnics and barbecues and drinking and those kind of things. So what you find in Australia and New Zealand is they run Dry July because it's in the middle of the winter there. So it's maybe easier for people to give up drinking. But all of these ones seem to be in the kind of English-speaking countries. They seem to do it in either January, a month of 31 days, or July, another month of 31 days. And for some reason, the French-speaking countries, not forgetting about Dry January in France, but there are some others that are run in France, in Belgium and in Canada that actually run their campaigns in February because it's about, it's 10% easier. You've only got 28 days to go through. So the Tournée Minerale in Belgium and 28 Jours Sans Alcool in Canada, which are run as well. So these things are becoming quite popular. And so there's a lot of interest in who takes part, why do they do it, and what difference does it make? So there's some research which has looked at the physiological effects, and my background is in psychology and public health, so I'm not an expert in the physiological effects, but there are plenty of other people who are and who have done these kind of studies. And what this research shows is that if you take a month off from drinking alcohol, even within that month, by the end of that first month, there are significant reductions in liver fat, in blood glucose, and in blood cholesterol. And these are all good things that are good in terms of the specific health of the liver, but generally for the body in terms, if you think about the importance of cholesterol and blood glucose for things like regulation of those for things like for diabetes, for cardiovascular disease, for a range of other conditions. So there's this evidence that if we do stop drinking, our body does respond fairly quickly. And what we're interested in is not just this kind of physiological effect, but also thinking about the psychological effects and also how long-lasting those effects might be. So what we've done over the years is to follow people up, to take a standard kind of approach to the research, which I've applied in different years from 2014 onwards, and I've had a bit of a break the last couple of years. But what we've generally done with the blue shaded parts is to get people, when they sign up for Dry January in December, or into around about today, about the 5th of January. That's the kind of time we normally take the cutoff to say, okay, if you've signed up by this stage, we'll include you in the research. And then we let people go over the month. We come back to them at the start of February in the pink shaded block, and we'll go back to people in the first week of February to do a follow-up survey with them. And then in some years, we've also done a 6-month down the track follow-up with people in the first week of August, where we'll go back to them again and say, okay, can we find out what's going on now in terms of well-being, drinking, health, those kind of things. And what we've done in each case is, in the studies of people taking part in Dry January, is when people register officially for the campaign, we send them a link to an online questionnaire, which is handled separately. People do a self-completed questionnaire, which uses validated measures that have been used, so measures of well-being and sleep quality and those kind of things, and alcohol consumption that have been used in past research. So we know that they're good measures of what's going on. And then we come back and we get people to self-report again at the end of Dry January, and then sometimes 6 months down the track. And what I've done to make it a little bit easier for the next couple of slides is the blue shaded bits will be with the baseline measures. They're going to be the blue colored bars that you'll see, and the pink shaded bits will be the 1 month follow-up to see what difference we kind of find in people's well-being. And I will talk you through each of these things as they pop up. So that's the kind of general design, is measure what's been going on just before Dry January, measure what happens just after, and then 6 months down the track to see what the longer lasting effects might be. And that's important because we want to look at the initial response while it's fresh in people's mind, what do people do, but also does it have any lasting effects, particularly because although Dry January isn't necessarily about the long-term getting people to stop drinking, the ideal situation would be that people might be drinking less and drinking in slightly less harmful ways. So it's really important to see whether it does have that knock-on effect, not just whether people can make it through the month, but whether it has those benefits later on during the year. And what we've found in those studies where we got people signed up for Dry January is we do get significant impacts on well-being. This is self-reported well-being. So if we take something like general health, these are all measured on a standard 5-point scale. If we take something like general health, we can see that compared to the baseline in the end of December, the start of January, there's a big, and this is statistically significant, there's a big increase in general health by the end of January. People report that their sleep quality also increases dramatically. So do their levels of energy, and so does their sense of concentration, their ability to concentrate on tasks as well. So it kind of seems to be that one of the more general kind of things you get from this is that people sleep better, they wake up feeling fresher, with more energy, and they can concentrate a lot better. And this is something that kicks in actually only about a couple of weeks into it. And so by the end of the month, people are really noticing these differences. And this is quite important when we think about the likelihood of longer term benefits, because often when we get messages about alcohol, we're told about, well, it's bad for your liver, it's bad for your risk of a range of different cancers, these things that are way off in the future. And people might think, well, I'm not quite sure how important my liver is. You can get cancer for lots of different things. I enjoy drinking. What difference is it going to make if I don't drink so much? And sometimes it's a bit hard for people to respond to potential health impacts that are way off in the future. But what this shows is that people actually they experience very quickly some of the benefits of not drinking so much within the month of January. And if someone said to you, I can improve your sleep, I can make your ratings of your sleep go from about 2.5 out of 5 to 4.5 out of 5, and it won't cost you anything, and you won't have to take any medicine, and you won't, whatever it might be, people will probably say, that sounds pretty good, what do I have to do? And it's like, well, you just don't drink for a while, and it's that makes it sound a little bit easier than it might be. But this is a really quite effective and cost-free way to improve general feelings of health, sleep quality, and concentration. So that's one of the interesting things we get. And this helps to explain some of the things we see later down the track when people continue, because they think, actually, I've experienced the benefits of drinking less. Maybe I will have a few more nights when I don't drink alcohol, or maybe I won't say yes to that extra glass of wine, because people have learned for themselves through doing what might be called a behavioral experiment. They've learned for themselves what benefits they actually get from not drinking so much. So that's one of the things that Dry January is interested in and is able to promote, is to say that people will get these benefits fairly quickly from cutting back or from not drinking at all. One of the other things that's interesting to look at is how does it relate to some of these other measures of how people feel about their drinking and how confident they feel about themselves, not just about their physical well-being. So we've also done measures of, and across the bottom, you'll see, I'll take you through these 5 different measures, and this time we've measured them on a scale from 0 to 7. But the first 3 are something that's the DRSE, which is there, is called drink refusal self-efficacy. It's basically people's confidence about, do they feel that they could say no to a drink in different situations? And it has different components. So the first one is saying, do you think you can say no to a drink if you're in a social situation where other people are drinking? And what we find is that people who complete dry January, they've got a significant increase in their confidence in being able to say no to a drink. We can also find a significant increase in whether people say that if they drink to cheer themselves up, this emotional drink refusal self-efficacy, there's an increase there. People feel better able to say, actually, you know what, if I'm feeling a bit down and I think that a drink would cheer me up, I'm not going to have a drink. I can feel confident that I don't want to have a drink in that situation. And there's also a significant increase in the drink refusal self-efficacy for what's called opportunistic drinking. So if it just happens to be that you open up the fridge door and there's a bottle of wine with a cork out of it, do you think, oh, there's an opportunity to drink? Well, I take up that opportunity. And people feel better able to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'll shut the door and I'll get myself a glass of water. So we find these significant increases in people's sense of control over whether they will have a drink or not. And that's something that people learn through that month. And because those changes are there, they tend to carry on over time. People feel more confident about their drinking. They carry that along with them for the next 6 months or 12 months. And that helps to explain some of the things we'll see later in terms of maybe people drinking less. What we've also measured, the 4th column along is a general measure of self-efficacy. There are still increases there in general self-efficacy. This is kind of like, can I complete challenges if I take them on? That's what self-efficacy is all about. Do I feel confident that I can complete the task that's assigned to me? And we find that there are increases in that self-efficacy, but not surprisingly, because that's a general measure that's not alcohol specific, those increases are smaller. And then the final thing we've got on this chart is to look at the abbreviation there, just because it wouldn't all fit across the bottom, is the Warwick and Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. So this is a scale for psychological wellbeing that was developed at the universities of Warwick and Edinburgh. And what we find is that people who complete dry January have a significant increase in their general sense of mental wellbeing. And this kind of reflects what we saw before with sleep and concentration and energy and those kind of things. So whether we use a single self-report item or we use a scale that's used a lot in research, this Warwick and Edinburgh measure, we find there's a significant increase in people's sense of mental well-being. So what we get from these 2 slides, is that people say, my sleep's better, I'm feeling healthier, I've got more energy, I feel more in control of my drinking, all these things, all these positive kind of benefits. And having done this research, and because we wouldn't have known about this without doing the research, what we now know is that Alcohol Change, who run Dry January, can then use these statistics to promote Dry January and encourage people to take part. So we're able to say, and this is the bit I like, where I get to see this is where my head inflates, because I get to see some of my stats on a website. This is a screenshot from the Dry January website that says things like, what we've found is that 79% of participants said they'd save money, 62% had better sleep and more energy, and 49% of participants lost weight. And it's interesting, you might think, why are those numbers so different? Saving money, why do people saving money but maybe not losing weight? One of the things we're interested in is that a lot of people, some of the times we've done some interviews with people as well as doing the questionnaires, and people said, yeah, well, I thought I was going to lose weight, but what I did is I got to the end of the week and I thought that I'd been so good and not drinking, I bought myself some nice chocolate biscuits, or I went and had a cake, or people were saying, I wasn't meeting my friends in the pub, I'd go to the cafe instead, and then I'd see this really tempting muffin there. So they were kind of substituting some of those pleasures, and that maybe explains why not so many people lost weight. But once again, if we go back to that thing and say, okay, here is a free treatment, which means that 50% of people who take it will lose weight, that's a pretty good ad, pretty good deal, I think, for that benefit that you might get. That's not to say, however, that it's an easy thing, and we'll see in a minute that not everyone completes it. We find that around about 2/3, so 65 to 70% of people who take on this challenge complete it. A lot of people will make it to about 25 to 30 days and maybe not make it to the end. And again, when we've interviewed people and done the survey, sometimes people say, well, I was going away on holiday, or I had a big birthday or a big celebration or something like that. But the thing that's interesting to note, and we'll see this on the next few slides, is that even attempting it, as long as you get part of the way through the month, just trying it out and seeing what you can do gives you some of these benefits. Not exactly the same benefits of having the same dry month, but it's better to try it, have a go, see what happens, than not to try it at all. So far we've found this. We've found out that people who take part in Dry January get all these benefits, but there was still a background question which we wanted to answer, and which other people asked of us as well, was to say, but what happens in the rest of the population? How do you know that this isn't just what would happen normally, or is it just people, reporting that these things are happening, not necessarily due to Dry January? So we wanted to do a bit more research about this, and this is what we kind of did next. So the question there became, what happens in the general population? And so until 2019, the surveys had only included people who register for Dry January. And what we needed there, what was missing, was a control group of people who were drinking alcohol at the start but didn't try Dry January. We wanted to follow people over time so we could see, is there any seasonal variation? Is it just the case that people feel happier when you go back to them in August because it's summer? How do we know that it's about Dry January, the long-term effects of Dry January, and not just the effect of, you're out of winter and you're feeling happier about things? And there's also questions about reactivity and Hawthorne effects, which basically relates to the fact that whenever we measure something, and particularly if people know that they're being observed or something's being measured, you kind of respond to that. And in a way, this is, strangely, it's a bit like, if you have a step tracker, for example, one of the things that they're based on, one of the reasons that they work, is because of this reactivity and Hawthorne effects. You know that you're going to have to enter your steps, or that you're going to get feedback on your steps. And so you do more steps because you don't want to get the message saying you failed the task. And we were worrying or wondering whether people getting all these messages about Dry January made them think about, Dry January, I must be feeling better because I'm not drinking so much. So the 2019 survey, as well as including 3,000 people registered for Dry January, we included 3,000 people who were adults, who were also drinkers, and we compared them to the people who were taking part in Dry January. And this meant that we could separate out what was attributable to Dry January and what was just kind of random sort of background noise. And so what we did before we did these comparisons, and in the slides that follow, I'm going to show you three groups. There's the group of people who were drinking who weren't registered for Dry January. There are people who tried to do Dry January but didn't make it through the month. And then there are people who completed doing Dry January. And we knew that when we did the survey of the general population, there were some people who said, actually, I am doing Dry January. And so what we did is we reassigned them to the Dry January group. So what we have is basically a really clear comparison between what happens if you do Dry January compared to what happens if you don't try to do that. And what we did statistically at the start as well is we made sure that we could compare them in terms of how much were people drinking at the start, were they older or younger, what was their health like in the first place, so that we could statistically account for these differences, so that when we made the comparison, we were really comparing Dry January against not doing Dry January. And what did we find? Well, the first thing we found was when we looked at, in this case, we're looking at those reports of physical well-being. It's the same scale we used before, the 1 to 5 points, but the scale is slightly different on the slide here. And what we've got is these 3 time points. January, the start of January, when people were starting or not starting Dry January. We had the start of February, so at the end of the Dry January month, and then we had August, the 6-month follow-up. And the 3 lines you can see, there's the people who made no attempt to change their drinking in the general population. That was fairly flat. Their reports of their general physical well-being stayed fairly constant. The people who tried to do Dry January had a small increase into February, and then it dropped back to pretty much to where they were in August. But where we found a more marked difference, or noteworthy difference, was the people who tried Dry January and stayed dry. And they had this clear increase in well-being between the start of January and the start of February. So by the end of Dry January, they were feeling better in terms of their well-being, and they maintained that until August. It really didn't drop off. So they started off, yes, they did start off slightly better in terms of their well-being, and they ended up in an even better place. So it seems to be that there are these benefits to physical well-being. The benefits to physical well-being that we saw in the earlier studies in those bar charts do seem to be largely attributable to Dry January, and it's not just because everyone is happier in August, we can see, or feeling better in August. We can see that the general population, that grey line, they didn't get the same increase. Some other changes we observed when we looked at people in terms of their mental well-being. So this is the Warwick and Edinburgh mental well-being score that we used before. And sorry, the yellow bar there just shows this is where you get this significant difference, and there wasn't a significant change for the other groups. when we looked at this mental well-being scale, we found a fairly similar thing. The people who didn't change their drinking, that was fairly flat. The people who tried dry January but didn't make it through, there was an increase in well-being by the end of January, and then that kind of dropped back to where they were. But what you can see is the pink line, the people who tried dry January and stayed not drinking for the whole month, had this really clear, they had the steepest increase in their mental well-being scores. And although it dropped off, it stayed high. So if you look at the three groups in January, they're all fairly closely clustered. If you look at them in August, the people who didn't make it through or didn't try are similar, and the dry January group is noticeably higher. There's a big increase. There's a big increase relative to where people started from, but also compared to the other groups. So again, we can say that not just in terms of physical well-being, but in terms of mental health, mental well-being, doing dry January seems to give these benefits that don't just happen to other people in the rest of the population. The other thing that was important to look at in terms of changing people's drinking was whether people felt more in control, whether they had that drink refusal self-efficacy. And this time what we've done, just to simplify things, not to give you three different lines, is I've kind of rolled them into one measure, which is something that's often done. And what we found here is that the drink refusal self-efficacy, the group that didn't even try dry January, they stayed fairly flat. They started off with more self-efficacy, but it didn't really change that much over time. And where we saw the biggest difference was actually that the pink group, the group that started dry January, they started off feeling less confident in their ability to control their drinking. And they ended up with a significant increase. And that's because they tried things out. They tried to go out and have dinner without a drink of wine. It's like, well, I can do that. Or they've gone to, at one night at home watching the football or something like that, they've not cracked open a beer. And it's like, you know what, I can watch the football without having a beer. I can do these things. I am more in control of drinking. I don't have to have a drink. And then the last thing I want to show you here in terms of the change over time from this three-group comparison was the changes in actual alcohol intake. And in this case, we've only got the two measures from January and from August because it didn't make sense to ask people in dry January if they hadn't had a drink because there would be a strange effect that we'd expect. But what we found instead is when we looked at people in terms of how much they were drinking, we used something called the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test from the World Health Organization. So it's otherwise called the WHO audit, which is a bit easier. And in terms of the WHO audit, people who were doing dry January, people who completed dry January, they started off being heavier drinkers. And we can see that there was, for all of these groups, there was a slight decrease in alcohol consumption between January and August. It was a little bit steeper among the people who tried dry January but didn't make it through. But the biggest change was among the people who tried dry January and stayed dry. So their scores on average fell from about 8.8 on this scale to about 6.8. So it was quite a big change. And what's interesting, those numbers probably don't mean much if you don't know what the test is all about. But we can see that yellow arrow shows it's a big drop. But the point that's really important here is that a score of 8 is normally used to indicate hazardous or harmful alcohol use. And what we can see is that the people who took part in dry January, on average, went from having scores that suggested they were on the edge of that hazardous or harmful alcohol use zone, and they'd moved into the non-hazardous or non-harmful area, which the other drinkers were in. So we can say that actually there's a longer term effect on people's actual patterns of drinking over time. And when we looked at it a bit more closely, we could see that people were tending to drink on 1 day less per week. And also on the days when they were drinking, they were having 1 unit of alcohol less per week. And it might not seem that much, but when you add it up over thousands of people over a year or over a person's lifetime, that means that they're exposed to a lot less alcohol. So something like dry January, you might think, okay, it doesn't have a big effect over time. It is a significant effect, but if you multiply that out over the years and years that people might live, you're actually reducing the harm from alcohol that they'd otherwise be exposed to. With an eye on time, and I know that I want to leave some time for questions, and I can already see there's some things popping up in the Q&A which I'll come to afterwards. I'll go to the last thing I want to talk about is, okay, so does it matter that people sign up for dry January? What if you just do a month of trying not to drink by yourself? And there's lots of campaign, not just in the alcohol, but in things like Stoptober around smoking is there because often people find it easier if they're part of a supported campaign to stop smoking. And dry January and veganuary with food as well, with eating meat or not eating meat is there as well. It's like people could try to cut down their meat consumption, but if you do it as part of a group with all the support, does it make a difference? And so what we did more recently was to do some studies to say, well, does it actually make a difference if people sign up to do dry January officially or if they just try it by themselves? So we wanted to ask about the importance of registering for dry January. And this is important because dry January, the charity Alcohol Change doesn't have a lot of money as a charity. They want to put their money into things that are actually going to work. So they were thinking about, well, we provide all this kind of support. Is it worth it? Could we just throw up this name Dry January, let people go and see what happens, because they do. They produce a website and blogs that require maintenance. They have email lists. They have their Twitter feed. They're on Instagram as well. They have Facebook pages and groups. So there are official Dry January Facebook groups that you can join if you sign up. And they also have, more recently, they've developed and redeveloped, and partly they've redeveloped it based on the earlier research. They've redeveloped the Try Dry app, where people can actually monitor their day-to-day. So every day you kind of wake up and, did you drink yesterday? Yes or no? If you did drink, how much did you drink? And people can tailor this in different ways. I've got another screenshot from the Dry January website. So it says you can download Try Dry in the App Store. And what you can do is you can set it, depending on what your interest is, you can set it to count how many units of alcohol have you not had, how much money have you saved, how many calories have you saved. You can ask for all these different things. But basically the idea is that we try to find the thing that's going to get people's interest, whether it's saving money or losing weight or not having so many units of alcohol. And people can choose the thing that's going to remind them and use that as a motivator to kind of keep on going. And you can see in the image on the right-hand side that, the dry days are the ones with the teacup with the cocktail umbrella, and the drinking days are the black ones, and there's a few gaps for this person. But the idea is it's a monitoring thing, which is kind of like that reactivity and Hawthorne effect. If you know that you're going to have to enter your details the next day, maybe that's going to be a motivator for you not to drink that night. And the other thing about this is that people can use it not just through Dry January, but for the whole year. So if they want to keep on going, it can keep on giving those reminders and that kind of support. So there is all this effort that's gone into providing this support. So we wanted to know whether it makes much of a difference. And what we found, again, by going back to the Dry January participants, is that people who make more use of this support are more likely to complete Dry January. And they're also more likely, therefore, to experience the short-term and the longer-term benefits. So I'll give you a few more figures just on the next couple of slides. But basically, we know that people who make more use of that support, whichever versions they take, they're much more likely to stay dry for the month of January. And because they're more likely to stay dry, they experience those physical benefits, they get more confident about controlling their drinking, and then in the longer term, they are actually drinking less as well. And the size of these differences, actually, we were quite surprised about how big a difference there was. So when we looked at people who registered for Dry January, so this is going back to the study where we looked at people in the general population, and we asked them afterwards, we said, did you try in any other way to cut back or to not drink? But you didn't register for Dry January. And we found the people who registered for Dry January, 70% of them had an actual Dry January. They made it through the month. Whereas the people who just tried to do it by themselves, only 30% of them made it through the month without drinking. So that initial kind of headline message says that registering for Dry January doubles your chances of staying dry during Dry January. And then we wanted to break down a little bit more about how that might come about. So one of the things we took in this particular study this year was to look at whether people made use of the email support, because people would choose how frequently they got emails. And the content is tailored at different stages to give you the initial encouragement or to encourage people to keep on going, to reward people towards the end. You've only got 2 more days left, those kind of messages. And what we found here is that the first thing was about how much use of the emails and those kind of things do people make. So around about 10% of the people who sign up for Dry January, they sign up, but they effectively do it by themselves. So they sign up officially, but they don't read, they choose not to get any of the emails. Around about a third of people say that they got some of the emails, but they didn't really pay much attention to them. And there was about half who read every email that came in. And when we asked them about them, they said actually they found them quite useful. And the emails contain motivational messages. They have suggestions for non-alcoholic drink recipes, those kind of things. So it's about motivation, but it's about that kind of practical support as well. And when we compared these 3 groups, what we found is the people who chose not to receive the email, or the people who only read some of them, around about 60% of those people made it through the month without drinking. But those who read every email, there was 68%, and that was a significant increase there. So there's some benefit then in, if you just pick the emails out as one particular kind of source of support, then it says that it does matter. So signing up and using the support is a much more effective way of doing Dry January than just trying it by yourself. And that was, I think, reassuring for Alcohol Change UK, who put quite a lot of time and effort into developing and improving and updating that kind of support that was there as well. So what we get from this, in conclusion, is that Dry January does make a difference for most participants. They do feel better in terms of their own reports of their well-being and their sleep and losing weight and whatever it might be. They also feel more in control of their drinking. And 6 months down the track, they're actually drinking less. So it seems to have all these quite common positive outcomes that happen to people. It's more likely to make a difference if people use the available support. And so that suggests that we need to encourage people to register officially for the official Dry January campaign. And then what we've got to do is make sure that we give those people the support that they want, support that's relevant to them, that motivates them in ways that make sense to them, or that gives them the kind of feedback and encouragement that they kind of need. And the ideal situation, in a way, would be to provide individually tailored support for everyone. And we know from other areas of research and interventions around behaviour change that tends to be the most effective way to get behaviour change. But if you're looking at something like a public health campaign like this, the intermediate kind of solution, which they've come towards with Dry January and other campaigns, is to say, we'll offer you all these things. You pick and choose the things that you want. And hopefully you'll get the support that you need, because we know that if you get the support you need, you're much more likely to make it through the month and enjoy all those benefits. So if you hadn't thought about Dry January before, if you were thinking maybe it wasn't your thing, and now I've encouraged you to do that, if you do want to sign up or want more information, there is the website that's there. I've also put into the chat earlier on, I put the same website. And that's where I've come to the end. And there's hopefully time, 15, maybe even 20 minutes or so for general discussion and questions and answer. There's my details again, if you want to follow up on them. And I'm sure that you could get them from signing up for it. If you don't have them here, you could contact Claire as well, and they'll be able to send your questions and things in my way. So I'm going to say thank you for your attention. Hope you found it interesting. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully we can go into the Q&A and have a bit of a discussion about things here. So.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Richard. That was really interesting to see the various different ways that people take on Dry January and the various successes and tactics to try and make it more successful for everyone. That was really interesting. Thank you. There are some questions definitely in the chat. So not in the chat, in the Q&A. So I'll let you kind of crack on with those. Through.
Okay, so if I click on answer live, I can get onto those. So yeah. So does 0% alcohol consumption count for Dry January? For example, 0% beers. If they are 0% truly alcohol free, then they would count. And that's one of the things that's been interesting, is to look at the growth in production of truly alcohol free drinks. So sometimes you'll find a beer which might be there's some interesting things about what's allowed to be labeled as alcohol free with an alcohol content of up to about 0.5% or something like that. So if you do want to take on Dry January and you would like to have an alcohol free beer, then make sure it's an alcohol free beer and not just a low alcohol one. Hopefully that answers that question. So okay, there is a next question, which is to say, how do you account for other factors that may affect well-being before the start of Dry January? Because the end of holidays do have an effect on well-being. And that's one thing that we were aware of, and that's what we tried to address with the later study where we did the comparison with the general population. And so what we could see actually in that one, it was interesting. There are some, we did find those improvements in well-being, and part of the reason for that is that we found that people were drinking more and they were a bit more worried about their alcohol consumption. So they started off from that position where maybe they had more to gain from taking part. But what we found is, even when we did when we did the comparison with the general population, people doing Dry January and the other people who weren't, we could see that there's still that difference, particularly when we followed people up over time. Because exactly what was stated in the question, we know that the holidays do have an effect on well-being, and holidays are different kinds. Sometimes people might find the Christmas holiday period really stressful and the summer holiday period in August not so stressful. But that's what we're trying to account for here. And we've not been able to do that perfectly, because we're still relying on the fact that we have the people who sign up for Dry January and do our surveys are the ones who've not only decided that they might want to do something about their drinking, they're already taking those steps. So they're not quite, they're not exactly comparable to the rest of the population of people who are drinking maybe in the same ways, but are not worried at all about their alcohol consumption. But that kind of question that was asked there is exactly the kind of question that was behind our thinking about doing the comparison with the general population. Because anytime you have any kind of intervention, you want to make sure you have the relevant control group to say, what would have happened if we hadn't had this intervention? So we're able to get close to that, but because we're not in a lab, and because we're not able to control all those different variables, we recognize there's a bit of fuzziness and variability around the edges. Hopefully that answers that question in a way that was appropriate. If not, you can put a follow-up in the Q&A as well. Okay. Okay, so the next question then was about how do you define if an increase or a decrease on the graphs is significant or insignificant or non-significant? Is a specific threshold? Okay, that's a good one, which is about the kind of stats and procedures. So it's not possible just to say that a change of a certain number, like 0.5 on a 5-point scale, is a significant difference, because it depends to some extent on the accuracy with which you can measure things in the first place. And so all of the statistical tests, the statistical procedures that we have take into account, because they take into account the size of the sample, we get an idea of how accurate our estimate of them. So if we're comparing the mean scores, for example, of the mean alcohol consumption scores, if we have a sample of 100 people and we take the mean of that, we know that that's an estimate of what we think is going on in the population. And the bigger the sample is, the more accurate that estimate tends to be. There's loads of statistical procedural stuff that will be behind that in terms of the precise ways of doing it. But basically, each of the tests that we've done take into account the size of the sample and the accuracy of the measurement in the two groups. And that's kind of why when we compared when we did the general population sample, we wanted to make sure that we had around about 3,000 people to start off with, because then we knew that we'd have enough people, enough drinkers of different types, to make sure we had those reliable kinds of estimates. Another thing that's interesting, though, is that we do need to look at not only the statistical significance, whether the numbers, whether the maths says there's a difference, but also whether that looks like a real difference in the real world. And that's why I thought it was interesting to highlight with the audit scores that the reduction that we saw, not only was it significant from a statistical sense, but it meant that people were moving from the high risk area to the non-risk area of that chart. And anytime we do any statistics, whether it's in a medical intervention or a drug trial or in public health in these areas, we're always interested in saying, okay, it might be statistically significant, but is it also clinically meaningful in terms of what difference will it make? And also in terms of drugs and those kind of things, we're saying, okay, it might be significant change, but is it so expensive that it's not going to be feasible? Is this a drug that costs £50,000 per person per year? So there's always that balance between what the numbers themselves say and how we interpret the meaning of those numbers. So, okay. So I think I've done that one. The next question, okay. In January, a lot of people have new resolutions like working out more, eating healthier. How do you know what the increase in well-being is because of dry January? That's a really good one. And that's because we thought of that and I didn't put it up on the slides that were there. So what we have done as well in both groups, in the group of people who are signing up to do dry January and in the general population, is we've asked them whether they're planning to, in January, at the start of January, asked them if they're planning to make any of those changes. And at the end of dry January, we asked them whether they had done things like exercising more or losing weight or whatever it might be. And we are able to take that into account. So we look at whether people have made those changes. And then after we've taken into account those differences, we then do the statistical test, which is to compare whether there was an increase in, if you look at weight loss, for example, obviously you need to take into account not just whether people are stopping drinking for the month, but also if they're not drinking and they're also eating differently and they're doing more exercise, you need to take that into account as well. And so that's what we did. And we can't completely rule it. We don't know that we can do it completely accurately because we're relying on the reports that people give using these validated measures. But we know that we can at least take into account that between the two groups where there are differences in who was exercising more or eating better, and then we can say, okay, once we take that into account, does the not drinking have an additional effect? And we can say that in this case, we know that there's something about the not drinking which seems to be having an effect. It's not purely attributable to those other factors, those other behavioral factors. You guys are really good. You should get into designing public health studies because you're asking all the right questions. So, okay. So Christopher's asked, will stopping alcohol consumption improve your immune system and help combat infections such as COVID? And if so, how does this happen specifically? Okay, so again, I can give you two bits of the answer. The first bit is I don't know precisely the physiology behind it, but we do know that reducing alcohol consumption is associated with improvements in immune function. And I actually have a PhD student who's doing some research during the first lockdown. She's actually got a paper that's just currently being reviewed for publication, where she looked at whether people knew this and whether messages that emphasized this had a significant effect. So to answer your question, we know that stopping drinking or reducing alcohol consumption will improve immune function, and that therefore should offer some protective effect against any kind of infection, but if COVID in relation to your specific question. And so what Fiona, my PhD student, what she found was that she gave people different messages. One was about drinking improves your sleep, for example, picking up on the research we've done, or another slightly more bland message. And then there was one saying, drinking less can boost your immune system. And she found that actually around about the time of the first lockdown last year, that message had a bigger impact than any of the other messages, because people were concerned about their immune system. And that goes back to, I think this ties into the point I was making before about, what motivates people to drink less? Is it because they want to save money or lose whatever it might be? And around that time, messages that emphasized the immune benefits of drinking less would have been really effective, because that's what people were concerned about. So that's another thing that we've not mentioned here. And it's not been assessed, as far as I know, in the studies that have looked at the physiological effects of dry January, but we know from other research that heavier alcohol consumption has an immune impairing effect, and reducing alcohol consumption can give system benefits as well. So hopefully that's answered that one. I've got to keep track of my list. Wow, that's good. More people more likely to make it through dry January if they're not much of a drinker before they signed up. Okay, so that, yes, what we've found is that people who are lighter drinkers to start with are more likely to make it through the month. But this is all, it is all probabilistic. So it doesn't mean that just because you're a light drinker, you're going to make it through. One of the concerns or criticisms that was made earlier was, it's all these people, they're just light drinkers during dry January. It's just easy for them. There's not much of a challenge. And we do find that it does seem to be easier for people who start off drinking less. But what was interesting is that we found, and you could see this in one of the graphs I showed earlier, is that what we actually found was, on average, people taking part in dry January were heavier drinkers than the rest of the population. So, and we got a whole range of people across the spectrum. One of the things we found in the first study we did was, when we looked at people who made it through and didn't, it was the heavier drinkers who were less likely to be successful. And in particular, the people who were drinking in really harmful levels were really unlikely to make it through the month. Like maybe only about half of them did. And that's because an intervention like dry January isn't appropriate for those people. If you're alcohol dependent, trying to go cold turkey by yourself or just by reading some emails from dry January, that's not a safe or effective way of giving up drinking. And so what they've tried to do is give more advice about that. But what we've found is that people who are lighter drinkers are much more likely to make it through. The people who, actually, maybe I'll stop there because I can see there's some other questions, but we do find that it is easier if you're drinking less in the first place, because maybe you're already more in control of your drinking, but also maybe there are fewer drinking situations for you to negotiate because you're drinking less anyway. Ros has asked about, is it based on self-report? And it is. So in this case, what we've done is we've used self-report using validated measures. So we don't have the objective measures of the impact of the physiological effects. And that's why I referred to those physiological studies earlier on. So we are relying on self-report in this case. Things like, if you take things like the alcohol consumption, the WHO audit, for example, that's recognized as either as a valid clinician administered tool, or as a self-report measure. There's quite good reliability in that measure as well. And with a study of this size, we're kind of really relying on self-report rather than meeting people in person. Keep ticking through the questions. Okay. Why is it the liver can regenerate itself but can't repair alcohol damage? That's one, I think, for the hepatologists and not for the psychologists to answer. So unfortunately, I can't do that. To some extent, it's about what gets regenerated and how much the capacity. It's the extent and the nature and kind of the depth of the damage as well. But unfortunately, I'm unable to really answer that. I don't want to say something that'll make me sound stupid or you sound foolish by passing on my misinformation. So, okay. What made me decide to study dry January? It was kind of interesting because I hadn't always done alcohol research, but I was doing some research on young people generally, and particularly young men's health. And one of the risk factors that really came up with some big differences about sort of young men's patterns of drinking and how it ties into views of masculinity and whatever else it might be. And we were doing some research in that area, and then some calls for funding came up saying, oh, we're looking for people to do some research in this area. And we thought, well, we could probably do that. And then I made contact with people, and then I heard the first time about this thing, Dry January, that was happening in 2013. I thought, I wonder if anyone's doing research on that. And so I contacted the people at Dry January and said, is anyone doing any research on this? And they said, no. And I said, well, can we do it together? And so they said, yeah. They said, if you can get things started, then we can do that. So I think but more than that, more than just saying, here's the thing. I mean, I'm kind of interested in lots of different topics. Generally, I'm interested in how people go about changing their behavior. And Dry January was a really good opportunity because there were a lot of people who were already doing it. And there was it wasn't like saying, okay, we're going to try to make this intervention and see if it works. It was like saying, there's something out there in the world already happening. Is it worth it? Does it make a difference? And that's what I thought would be a good one to go for. And the next question actually follows on and says, what do you see as the next steps for this research? Some of the things that I'm interested in, what I'd like to do is actually follow people longer term to see actually what happens, not just 6 months down the track, but 1 year later. And we know a lot of people come back and do Dry January kind of year after year. So it'd be interesting to track those people through the year. Do they use it as a once a year reset and kind of detox kind of thing, or are these people who are gradually cutting down and cutting down and cutting down? I've done some research with meat-free Mondays as well, and that's an interesting one because again, you look at whether people just stick to doing Mondays or whether it spreads to the rest of their lives as well. And I think that broader interest I have in how people start changes in behavior and then how they carry on with them, and whether they carry on with them, I think is really interesting because often from a psychological perspective, often what it means is that people are having to change their identities as well. So they may be saying, well, I call myself a flexitarian, or no, I'm not a flexitarian anymore, I'm a vegetarian, and I'm not a vegetarian anymore, I'm vegan, or at what point do people say that they're just doing Dry January, or that they become a light drinker, or they're just a social drinker, or whatever it might be. I think it's looking at those changes over the longer term is, I think, what I find quite interesting. So that's those two. There's questions coming in fast, I can answer them. And unfortunately, we may not be able to get through them all. So, but with the drinking group, aren't the results merely reflecting the variation in the personalities of the individuals? So some already possess the potential inner strength to seriously reduce their unit consumption, whereas others haven't, and the spectrum in between. It's generic or genetic diversity within a population. Yes, there is some of that variation, but what you tend to do in this kind of research, in this analysis, is you do what's called a within subjects comparison. So you take into account, it's not just the change that was there between the two groups, but it's the change within the group compared to itself at the starting point. And that's not to say that there might not be some broader personality or other differences that are in there, or attitudinal differences. I mean, the very fact that we get some people who are voluntarily going in and giving something that they otherwise enjoy suggests that there's something about their views about that which makes them different from the people who aren't taking on that challenge. So it is likely that there are some of those differences in the beliefs. And we found, for example, that the people were more concerned about their drinking. We know, for example, that in other studies that people who are more conscientious generally, if they follow through on their plans, or if they, kind of put away the dishes that are left in the drying rack, those kind of things, they complete those tasks. Just that kind of general personality trait is associated with living longer, because they're also the kinds of people who tend to follow the advice to live healthily as well. So it's likely that there is some personality kind of variation that's there as well. I mean, that would be another one that's interesting to look at. I think picking up from this question and going backwards is saying, okay, what happens for the people who are struggling? What's the difference between someone who makes it through, says, this is difficult, but I'm going to make it through, and someone who says, this is too difficult, I'm going to give up? Because I think that's an interesting one, is to say, what happens to the 30% of people who really want to do it in January, at the start of January, and at some point think, I can't do this at the end of this. Okay, the next one is a question which was about, how do you check the people who claim to be dry were actually not drinking alcohol secretly? And that's one of the things that we you can't get around in this, can't get past in this kind of research. We know that, and that was part of the reason as well, like getting a group which we didn't mention anything about. The control group, for example, we didn't say anything about this is about Dry January. We kind of hid the questions about alcohol in a much broader questionnaire. So it was harder for people to guess there. But we always have these issues about whether people who are claiming to be dry or not are actually staying dry in these cases. One of the things that gives us a little bit of confidence is that we see that if people are not telling the truth about their drinking, then they're also across the board not telling, for the stats to work out the way they do, they'd have to be not telling the truth across the board about all the other measures that kind of come up there as well. And it's possible within this research, we didn't put in too many of these kind of questions, but you can have some validity checking questions where you ask people. There are different ways of assessing how truthful people are being in the research. It's a slightly different topic than what we might be able to cover here, but that is a question that always comes up in the self-report literature is how accurate it is. Outside of this context, when you do reports of either what people say they're drinking, you compare it to metabolic markers, for example, and you can do this with smoking cigarettes as well. You can actually tell how accurate people's self-reports are. At the population level, you can also look at things like how does the purchasing patterns vary over the year, and does that reflect changes in people's reports of their drinking as well? And so it's not a perfect measure, but we're confident enough that it tells us enough about what's going on. Okay, and I'm just wondering, Claire, how we're doing for time, whether I can do the last...
I think you've got time to just do the last one. You've got like a minute left.
Yeah, okay. So what's the best way to help someone with withdrawal effects? I think the answer there is if there's someone who is experiencing or thinks they might experience withdrawal effects, is not to try it alone, is to actually consult maybe a GP in the first place, consult one of the various alcohol charities like Alcohol Change UK, which also have on their sites lots of referrals and information as well, because it's not something to do by yourself. And actually sometimes it can be more dangerous because the short term, the really acute effects can actually put people at great risk of injury and harming themselves and potentially other people. So, okay, and the last question that's there is about, do you think the use of self-report methods led to participants giving more socially acceptable responses? There is always a kind of a risk of that, but as hopefully I've answered that slightly in some of the other ones. We know that how we present the questions and the way that it's packaged within a broader set of questions that's maybe not as obviously about alcohol use, we try to minimize those effects, but we can't get rid of them completely. So yeah, lots of questions. I managed to get through them all. Thanks everyone for coming along. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and maybe it'll help you get through dry January or think about starting dry January.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard, for your talk tonight. I was really interested, and thank you so much for taking the time to answer all those questions. They were really good questions. I was really impressed by the standard of questions that came in, really well thought about. Hopefully you will enjoy that talk, and I can see some nice comments coming in the chat there for you as well, Richard.